I think sometimes the public thinks of a migraine as a bad headache. There are other neurological symptoms because when you're losing your vision, when you get numbness and tingling in your arms, your legs, and weakness, it's looking more like a stroke than a headache.
Why women tend to get migraines in their luteal phase, so after ovulation, a week or two before their period.
When you ovulate, that is the most yang time of your cycle. And if you don't have enough support from your yin, the yang is going to go off the rails.
MG McCullough. MG is a doctor of Oriental medicine. MG has been coined the migraine acupuncturist.
Coffee is a really tricky one for people with migraines or even headaches in general. If we don't have enough resources to ground us, anything that raises the energy is going to become a trigger.
This is like $1 million question, but what causes migraines? Today, we're going to be talking about all things migraines. And in order to do so, we have a really special guest with us today. This guest is a dear friend of mine and a colleague, MG McCullough. MG is a doctor of Oriental medicine. She's also a licensed and practicing acupuncturist. She practices locally in South Carolina and remotely worldwide. MG has been coined the migraine acupuncturist from her work and understanding in migraines. And I'm really excited to have her on here today to explain to us more about migraines and how you can support your health. So welcome, MG, and thank you for being here today.
Hi, thank you for having me. I'm super excited anytime I get to talk about Chinese medicine.
Me too, and I'm excited to see you. I feel like we text a lot, but we don't actually see each other visually a lot.
Yeah, face to face. We should
face to face
do something different.
Right. So to get started, why don't you tell everyone a little bit about your history with migraines, what you got you into the work, anything background information?
Yeah, totally. Well, I started having migraines when I was 10 years old is the earliest that I can remember. And, it was just a hot mess. Like all of a sudden your vision starts going and you see weird things. It was the whole aura experience. Like when I was a child, I used to get vomiting along with it, like a lot of nausea, and I would actually vomit. And then it just would wipe me out and I would sleep for like 12 hours. And this didn't happen, on a very regular basis. I guess it happened regularly, but not like anything that I could track. And of course I was 10 years old, right? So my perception of what happened, may or may not be helpful. But throughout the years, they would kind of come and go. Right. So when I was older, then they would come back and I would get them here or there. Right. And then I was good for a while and then they would come back again. And when I was in acupuncture school, I moved from South Carolina to LA in my car. I was living in a sketchy place and I was getting treatments like modern acupuncture treatments in the school clinic. And I was just getting worse. And I was like, I never want these treatments again. Like, stop doing it. Like, this is enough for me. But yet I was learning with some instructors all of this Taoist medicine also. And I shouldn't say all of this, just like little drops, like they would add it into their classes, right? And I was like, this makes so much sense to me. And it contradicts what I'm getting done in the clinic and what I'm experiencing in the clinic. And so I just think there's something more here. And then about that time, I was really frustrated with modern acupuncture, and I also decided to transfer schools back to New Mexico. And I was just beginning clinic, and I talked to my clinical supervisor about this feeling that I was having about the modern stuff. It doesn't feel like that's really where it is. Like, what is this thing? And she then introduced me to what we call the Red Book and clinical manual. And Anne was starting to come teach in Albuquerque. So I started, that started my whole journey. And then I graduated school and my migraines had become like heinous during school because I also was a spin instructor. And when I graduated school, I opened my own spin studio. And that just basically put everything over the edge. And so that's when I had a migraine that I lost my ability to talk. And I would truly lose my vision for 45 minutes to an hour. Fortunately, all these things have come back, but it was just a full body experience. And I think sometimes the public thinks of a migraine as a bad headache. And you certainly don't want to get into like classifying like what's legit, like what's really a migraine, what's not. I mean, I think that's impossible to do. But what I'm trying to describe is there could be people who have daily pain that is just really difficult to function with. And then there are also the neurological symptoms. And that's really what I experienced and also what I'm most interested in treating. Like, obviously we want to help everyone, but that's what I'm really geared toward Because when you're losing your vision, when you get numbness and tingling in your arms, your legs, and weakness, it's looking more like a stroke than a headache. So that's what really got me into acupuncture.
But for those of us, for the listeners, could you just explain a little bit what you mean when you say modern acupuncture? Because I think most people don't understand what that means.
Yeah, absolutely. I wanted to get into that at some point. So that's great that you asked the question already. Back in the day, the full system of acupuncture was something called the primary channels and then the complement channels. And so you guys, if you're listening to this and you're like, I'm not here for a history lesson on acupuncture, just bear with me. This is like a quick thing, and then you'll understand so much more from here, especially if you've had acupuncture and it wasn't helpful for you. This will make a lot of sense. So there were primary channels, and those channels, 12 of them, help us with the day-to-day functioning, 24/7 functioning of our bodies, right? Anything that threatens those channels functioning is then going to be assisted by the complement channels. And if you're a TCM acupuncturist, you may have heard this in school called secondary vessels, which is really a misnomer because it's not at all secondary. It's really actually like primary stuff. So the nomenclature is kind of unfortunate in that respect. It's kind of confusing at first. But you're thinking about the primary channels. Their primary function is like keeping us alive. We wake up in the morning, we open our eyes, we breathe, we go to the bathroom, we eat, all the things. But if anything becomes a threat to that functioning, the body has this innate, amazing system that helps it by taking that threat and like storing it away through resources. So what happened when Mao took over China was that he wanted to be modern and Western. And so he erased the entire practice of acupuncture. And after people started getting sick, he decided, okay, what we're going to do is we have this committee that can put together point prescriptions, and we're going to pull those points that we think will be effective for the majority of people's issues and make a cookbook, so to speak. And we're going to train all these people to send them out into China to help. So if somebody has stomach problems, here's what you're going to do. Back pain, here's what you're going to do, et cetera, right? And so that's what modern acupuncture is. It's now called traditional Chinese medicine, but it's really not traditional. And sometimes people will tell you, or you'll hear, TCM is thousands of years old. That's not really a true statement. It's based on something that's thousands of years old, but really it came about, I'm not great with history, but 1950s-ish,
I think it's 1950s, yeah.
Yeah, so mid-century, So it's not thousands of years old practice. And it helps a ton of people. It's really helpful for a lot of things. But when you get into something like migraines where you can't see and you have numbness, it's not able to reverse that kind of disease process. And so it's really important just to understand the difference. And like, not only as a practitioner, but also as a potential patient, you can make a better decision for yourself about if this person is a modern acupuncture practitioner, they may be able to help me with these things over here, but I may need another type of practitioner if I have something maybe more involved, more progressive, more debilitating, that kind of thing.
Right. And, most of us go to TCM school, right? I went to a TCM school. I believe you did too. I think all the schools in America, at least, are TCM because you have to pass the boards. So you need to learn TCM to pass the boards.
Yeah.
But also what we're taught in TCM school is that we can't treat a lot of these things. So a lot of these things TCM practitioners won't actually even treat you for. They will refer you out to, see you as a red flag, when in reality, you can be treated by acupuncture and Chinese medicine. It's just, you're not seeing the right person.
Yeah, absolutely. And I did go to a TCM school, but I was fortunate that many of my teachers were also studying with Anne at the time. So when I jumped into that there were other people around. And I think that was an incredibly fortunate experience because I got there were people around me to talk to about this and to learn more. But I think what really was the icing on the cake for me with regard to acupuncture can't treat XYZ was when I went to the ER, when I lost my ability to speak. I spent, a full day there. I had the full workup, CT, MRI, a full neurological exam, where they have you do all the things. And then, the results that I was waiting for, you're fine.
How does that feel because you're fine and you can't see or speak?
Right. Like that cleared me for a belief in someone in allopathic medicine was going to be able to help me. I know what I experienced and I won't be gaslit. And I'm not saying that they said it didn't happen, but they told me I'm fine. And that means we don't have any data to do anything with. So that meant to me, you're on your own. And I wasn't on my own. I had classical Chinese medicine. So that really just forced me into a deep dive that if I was not going to continue on this route the rest of my life, I had to do a lot of things different. And then I took a class with Anne on divergence, and I was treated in that class, and it was a really profound treatment. And she gave me a lot of dietary and lifestyle advice that completely, changed everything. And that was kind of the beginning of, it wasn't a quick journey, right? It was a very involved process. But there were a lot of things that needed to change. And through studying with her and learning from her, I was able to help myself. And then that became what I've been mostly focused on in my practice, migraines and autoimmunity and any other, I always say weird disease, any other weird thing that you have that people are like, we don't know and nothing's wrong with you. Your lab works fine.
Right. For our listeners who don't know what MG's referring to when she says Anne, she's referring to Anne Cecil Sturman, who is a wonderful gift to the medicine of classical acupuncture and one of the main teachers here in the US and worldwide that teaches the medicine.
I was just going to say the beauty of Anne is that she was able to distill, I think, 25 years of studying with Jeffrey Yuen. So Jeffrey is a lineage holder. So the classical texts in Chinese medicine, obviously, just to rope everyone, all the listeners who aren't into Chinese medicine as it is, what Catherine and I practice is a lineage from classical Chinese medicine. So just like there are religious texts that have been edited over time, many times, there are different versions of religious texts, that too happened in Chinese medicine. And so it's really critically important to learn the details from someone who had the oral transmission and the oral tradition passed down from them. So our Anne's teacher is an 88th generation Taoist priest. So he learned from his grandfather. And the difference that makes is that you get the nuance. Whereas if you and I, whoever just picked up a classical Chinese medicine text, we could read it, sort of, and we wouldn't always understand the details of it because there's a little bit of code. And
the words have different meanings, right? It's translated from Chinese, which is a very different language than English, and it has characters to actually describe things. So when we decode Chinese text, it's very much a loose translation to the actual understanding of the meaning in the words.
Absolutely. Absolutely. So just for everyone's benefit. So there are a lot of people that have studied with Jeffrey, and there are a lot of people out there doing great work and teaching what they know and sharing what they know, writing books and that kind of thing. And what Anne was able to do was distill all of that knowledge into a practical guide for all of us. So it's basically learning this medicine on crack, so, we could spend 15 or 25 years studying with Jeffrey also, and we may or may not be able to distill it in our minds, organize it in a way. So the gift that she has been to our profession, obviously to us directly is just incredible. And then also to the patients who benefit from our ability to apply the medicine in that way that helps them reverse complicated disease processes so they can go on and have children and live life healthfully and happily. It's pretty profound, actually. Sometimes I get overwhelmed thinking about, I may not have had this opportunity if I lived at a different time.
Yeah, totally. This is the $1 million question, but what causes migraines?
Yeah. Okay. So
strap in for the next 10-hour talk. No kidding.
Yes. Yeah. Okay. So buckle up. No, just kidding. Depletion is how I would distill it down, because the complement channels that we just talked about rely on resources that in the medicine we call mediumship, hold pathology in latency. And I like to think of this as remission, right? So when we get symptoms of anything, our joints are hurting, we're having spotting, we're getting dizzy, we have autoimmunity issues or diagnoses. All those things are a sign that we have lost enough resources that the channels that were working for us all those years cannot keep up. They can't do it anymore. So when I say depletion, I don't mean just that you need a nap. I mean that you likely probably need an overhaul. So how are you living that is contributing to such a depletion of these resources? And some of those things are not choices that we make. Some of those things are that we live in an environment that has a lot of things that are overloading those channels all the time, that the channels are having to do all this work. If you grow up on a regenerative farm in the middle of nowhere and you're not exposed to pollution and lots of medications and you drink clean water and you eat warm, wet foods, right? Like you're probably not likely to have the same taxation on your system that someone like the rest of us who live in a more urban, modern setting are up against, right? So when you have worn out those channels, essentially that mediumship, you get symptoms, and that applies to pretty much anything. So that's why I say I think depletion is the key to why we get migraines, and what all is contributing to that. That is a much longer discussion. A lot of early life experiences, in my experience, has contributed to people's migraine experience as adults. So when we use those channels that pertain to the early years, we're able to rewind that process, sort of adjust, and then people get better.
Right. So when you say early life experiences, I'm assuming you essentially mean trauma in some sense of the word.
Yeah, I think so. So.
Yeah. The way I describe, so I did a previous episode on trauma, and the way I described it is anything that keeps you from living in the present moment, right? So anything from the past that affects how you live today or affects you moving forward in the future, or any time in your life when emotions were too big or too little, meaning you felt too many emotions or you weren't getting enough staff, you weren't getting enough love and support and safety.
Yeah. And I think commonly what happens is we are raised by people who are uncomfortable with emotion. So it gets shut down. So as a child, your emotional response to any given thing could be completely normal, but it's perceived as abnormal or a nuisance or uncomfortable. And so the people who are taking care of you, it's not that they don't love you, but they think that it's unnecessary or that it's unimportant. And so it's dismissed, it's shut down, because it's just not something that is fully understood. And I used to think that it was just an American thing, but through studying with Anne and getting to have colleagues from all around the world and hearing their stories of their own experiences, their patients' experiences, this seems to just be a human experience, that if you grew up with parents who were comfortable with their own emotions and with your emotions, then you are super lucky and you're very rare. Like we found a unicorn, because I just think the human experience is that we're not comfortable with emotions and we don't fully understand the importance of them. And I think that's a tremendous contributor. But even things like the way we're born, like we come into the world and sometimes there are complications when we birth children, and that separates us from our baby because there is a physical emergency that the mother needs to be attended to or the baby needs to be attended to. And that's no one's choosing, and it's no one has control over that. But it does set us on a path in a sense, and that can lend itself to other issues down the road. It's not always. Yeah, I think that's a contributor. I find that the pulse that is reflected in often comes up in my migraine patients. What I see most commonly in migraine patients is that they have a pulse that indicates there's something in their early life that set them on this path. And like you were saying too earlier, you mentioned something about like how we're operating, and I don't always think that it's conscious. It's just like these channels, like we also talk about as sort of our blueprint, the channels that are there very early on and affected very early on. And I think it's like, using a roadmap for your life, but not even realizing the map that you're using. It's not like a conscious.
Right.
I'll
frequently have patients tell me that whatever their symptom is, they think it's genetic because their mom had it too. And I'm like, well, is the symptom genetic, or is the fact that your mother was always a warrior and taught that behavior onto you, quote unquote, genetic, right?
Yeah.
Genes can be a big word, I guess.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think if that's very present in a lot of processes, like what we learn in our families. And I would say that if you're exposed to it every day for however many years, how could that not affect your genes? Even if we just use a loose genes as a loose term, it's our programming, it's our patterns, and those patterns we can come into the world with it, certainly. And like you can look at body types. People sometimes are built like their parents because their parents produced them. Those are genes, right? But sometimes there are other factors that are influenced by the conditioning, like what we eat is learned in our families. We can change that. It can be very difficult to make those changes, right? But like we're conditioned in our families to eat the way we eat, and by our culture, like where we live, what we have access to, like all those things. So, I mean, I agree with you. I think that it can be genetic. And if it's been present for a long time, that can still put you in that group of channels that you could benefit from by receiving those treatments.
Right. So just to summarize, it sounds like the migraines are caused mainly by depletion of resources, which things that deplete resources can be over-exercising, under-resting, under-eating, being overstressed, working too hard, and then holding stored emotions and stored trauma in our body, which it takes a lot of resources for our body to hold it there. So we'll deplete resources over time. Does that sound?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, to add a little bit more to that is that what I've been noticing and thinking about a lot with migraines and autoimmunity, I joke with my patients and who say they come in and they say, I have migraines. And I'm like, do you feel that you or anyone you know who has migraines is a relaxed person? And they always laugh and they're like, no, I'm a recovering type A myself, and I think it makes it easier to say because I also am in that, so it's not a judgment, but it is an observation. Many of us are recovering type A, or maybe we still are type A. And I think it's high achieving, high performing people, right? Like the relaxed person who doesn't feel like they have to control anything, the person, like those people do not tend to have migraines, and maybe they have their own different thing, whatever. That's not what we're talking about today. I'm just saying there is sort of a picture that I've been noticing. And I do think that those early experiences that shape the channels, then, like I was saying earlier, set us on a path where we make those decisions that are different from someone else. So why do you think it's normal to take 27 or 28 hours in acupuncture school? Like, why do you think it's normal to work a part-time job and then teach 3 or 4 spin classes a week? Why do you think it's normal to open a studio where you teach? Okay, this is personal experience, right?
You know yourself right now.
But I see myself, and the fitness industry is an incredible example of the complement channels at work. There are people who genuinely love what they're doing. They love helping other people. They love moving their bodies. They're into how to fuel their bodies, and they're following modern, trendy diet advice. And they have migraines. They can't get pregnant. They have autoimmune diagnoses. And sometimes they talk about it, sometimes they don't, right? But it's really, really clear how those early experiences set you on a path that then have you doing things that create deficiency. And it's obviously extremely difficult to shift your mindset into, oh, wait, even though that thing I love so much is so fun, like it brings me such joy to teach a spin class. And so that's no longer part of my life. And that's it feels like in some way a huge loss.
Sure.
But I can choose. I could keep doing that or not.
I also think we can explore why do we enjoy doing that so much and how can we fulfill it in another way, right? Like I used to run, love running. I ran lots of half marathons. I ran marathons. And it's what about that was actually bringing joy? And yeah, it wasn't joy because you get a high from running and endorphins and achieving a goal, but it was actually more like a pathological thing where I was trying to essentially run away.
Yeah. That was actually one of the first questions that Anne asked me. What are you running for? I also used to run. And I was like, what do you mean? Because to me, I was not self-aware enough at the time to be able to answer that question. I'm like, I hear you asking me that, but I almost thought she was joking.
Right. And that's why we go to other people and ask us those questions and to help guide us to answers a lot of the times.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. And yeah.
Yeah. So another question that people will ask often about migraines, and I think in a lot of sense, we just answered this, but just to make it more like black and white clear, what triggers migraines? Often when people get migraines, they're always looking for a trigger. Like, why did it happen this time and not that time? What is your response to that?
Right. Okay. So back to the resources. Okay, you don't have to raise it. This want to comment. So the ideas, I don't know if you've talked about this yet with your listeners, the ideas of yin and yang, like yin being like a rooted energy and yang being the energy that rises. I always describe it to patients as, and I don't know if I can swear on this podcast, so you can edit later.
Swear. Go for it.
That yin is your rest, if you want to think about it like that, resting, grounding.
Yeah.
And yang energy is like your get shit done energy. And we need both, and like another analogy that I like to use commonly is if you go take a bath, you're not going to just turn on the hot water. That would be yang because it's going to get too hot for you.
Right.
You need the cool with the warm so that you have a really nice bath that's comfortable. It is really warm, but you're going to mitigate the warmth of that hot water with a little bit of cold.
I love that. I love all your analogies. For those that you don't know, MG, you should follow her on social media, but she has the best analogies.
This is how I think, y'all. Like I have to simplify things for my brain. And Chinese medicine is really rooted in nature, like in observations of nature, like what happens. And so the water example to me is kind of an extension of that, right? And likewise, like you don't want a cold bath. Well, okay, some people do, and that's a topic for another
podcast. Don't cold plunge. That's all you need.
We are never going to find balance by doing extreme things. That's, if you don't remember anything that we talked about today, remember that. So anyway, back to the yin and yang. So a common thing I hear from people is, when I drink alcohol, I'm going to get a migraine. That is a trigger for me because alcohol is raising the yang energy. It's moving energy up. But we don't want energy up if we already have a situation where there's too much here. We need it to be rooted and grounded. And the other thing that really stinks about that is that the more you raise your yang energy, the more depleted your yin becomes because the yang energy has to have support from the yin. So when we work with people on things like this, we're talking about not doing the HIIT exercise, keeping it low key. We're not trying to get our heart rate up high because that's too much raising, which might trigger a migraine for you. But also in the process, it's not helping you rebuild the yin, which you desperately need.
Right. It's for the situation resources.
Exactly. Just further depletion, more and more and more. So I think for the most part, that's how I see triggers. Triggers are things that raise the energy. And then you have what allopathic medicine calls a migraine attack. So the actual incident of getting pain or getting an aura, whatever the other symptoms are that you might experience. And again, I do think that too much stimulation just in general can become a trigger for people. And that shut down it's your body in a sense overreacting, but trying to talk to you. Your body has been trying to say something for a long time and it has not been possible for you to listen.
Right. That checks out.
Right. And so losing your vision, losing your ability to speak, that's a pretty good sign that your body is saying enough, like it has to stop, right?
Right.
Something.
Right. So things that raise yang energy, you mentioned alcohol, coffee, right? Coffee.
Yeah. And I think coffee is a really tricky one for people with migraines or even headaches in general because it often helps. Right. And I think about it like bulldozing. We've gotten this stagnation because we don't have enough yin. The river does not flow if there's not enough water in the river, right? I've lived in New Mexico my whole life, right? Like we need everything flowing smooth, right? Like, okay, you live in New York, right? Like how's the traffic?
I'm picturing a river. We got it.
We got a river. Okay. But I'm trying to think of what applies to people. Like when I lived in New Mexico, this was an easy thing to talk about water in the creek bed because there's no water and it gets stuck. So you might have a little tiny pool. If you live in New York or LA, used to live in LA, like we want traffic to flow, but traffic does not flow. You sit stuck forever, right? And then that creates heat. The stagnation, the backup creates heat. And then heat and the stagnation create pain. And this is also what lends people to not only drink coffee, but like put these ice things on their head, right? Like I've heard of ice wrap. This is the worst idea ever, but I understand that people don't have this information. So they do what makes them feel better in the moment.
Right.
Again, not realizing that you're further solidifying the problem.
Right. And the problem is essentially that heat is rising to the head. So when people go for a cold wrap, in some sense, they're trying to combat that. But can you explain why that's bad?
Yeah, because cold stagnates your energy, right? So you put honey in the refrigerator for some reason, and then you try to get it out and it doesn't move. But if you just have it in your cabinet, it's no big deal. You can easily scoop it out, squeeze it out, whatever. Like we don't want a bunch of cold in the game because it stagnates our energy. And then we're back to the same problems. Stagnation creates heat.
Right. And you freeze this river, it's obviously not going to flow.
Exactly. Like ice does not move.
Right.
We want flow. So why would we use ice?
Right. And then you're adding cold to the body, which causes pain in general.
Exactly.
Which causes pain.
If I go off the rails and eat ice cream, it is almost a guarantee that either my stomach or my head is going to hurt. And probably both. Right. But I can feel it, right? And years ago...
Stomach for me, but...
Yeah. But like I didn't notice that many years before. And now I do, which is good and bad, right? I mean, ice cream is delicious and I like to eat ice cream too. But the same thing can be said of like smoothies and juicing and all that kind of stuff that sounds like a great idea to like get your fiber and your vegetables and whatever, your athletic greens powder, I probably shouldn't say a brand, whatever greens powder you're using. That's not a good idea because it's too much cold. Do we want you to eat greens? Of course we do, but we want you to cook them, right? And I think another component of the cold is the way that it stagnates. It creates heat. And then what does heat do? It dries. So then we've got all our resources that we need over here. Actually, we already don't have enough. And then we're going to dry those even further as a byproduct of putting cold in our bodies, on our bodies, cold plunging.
Right.
None of that is good for a person. I can probably say for anyone, but for someone with migraines or autoimmunity, that's not what we want.
Right. I think that the way to put it is it's not good for anyone. If you're in perfect health, which whatever that means, you could probably withstand it.
Totally.
But it's still not good for you.
Totally.
Yeah. So go ahead.
If I trip on my sidewalk and I land on my face, it's going to hurt. But if, someone who is much, much older than I am and maybe much more frail trips on the sidewalk and falls on their face, it might mean a broken hip or, I mean, hopefully not if you've been taking care of your channels and your mediumship, right? But the intensity of the effect is more significant if you're already in a state that is less than robust.
Right.
And yes, for all of our people listening who have something going on, that's not what we want.
Right. So we have coffee, alcohol that raises heat, then things like stress, anger, anxiety, and overwhelm, right? Those are all things that will raise heat as well.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
Which for a mother could be having your 2, 3, or 4 kids just screaming at you all the time, right?
100%.
That's overwhelm. Yeah.
100%. So then I think in that situation, it's looking at why is that overwhelming to you? Whereas for someone else, it's not overwhelming. Well, that goes way back and that goes real deep where we have to think about how we were raised. What was our environment like? What would have happened if we ourselves were screaming at our parents? Perhaps it's a trigger, right? I mean, this stuff gets very deep and
that's a good point. Because I said that's a good point because one thing that's overwhelming for one person isn't overwhelming for another person. And that goes back to our early childhood triggers.
Absolutely. I think the way those channels were formed or not formed, our earlier experiences. And I just want to reiterate that not everyone with migraines has some kind of really conscious experience of this was really horrific. I've had patients on all ends of the spectrum. But usually when I ask what was going on early in life, there is a story. There is something. And sometimes it's not until the second or third appointment where people say, you know what, I think it is important that I talk to you about this, right? It's up to them. They don't have to.
Do you find that there is a tie since between yourself and all the patients you've treated with migraines, do you feel like there is, one emotion or one core belief that you see a lot of?
I see a lot of yin chow mai.
Right. So
this is a channel that actually both chows, but I see a lot of something's wrong with me.
Yeah.
And it's not always a fully held belief, right? It's like very like deep. Consciously you don't think anything's wrong with you.
Sure.
You're just like, why am I having this problem? Like, why is this happening? But if you get real deep with people, and I do think that your ability to heal yourself is correlated strongly with your ability to self-reflect and dig in. I don't think this is not a surface level type treatment. I don't think we always have to talk about things, but I do think it's helpful.
I agree.
And also as a part of my practice, I use Byron Katie's work of asking yourself if the belief that you have is actually true. And then I do this with myself as well, because I've studied with someone who uses this. Trying to prove to yourself that something that you believe is true generally results in actually you don't know it's true. You cannot prove it's true. And in doing that, it reshapes the way that you think. And then as a result, the way that you operate. And then in many cases, the health problem is no longer a problem.
Right. So to give an example of Byron Katie's work for listeners who aren't familiar with her, which I feel like a lot of people probably aren't, do you want to give an example or do you want me to?
No, you do it.
Okay, let's see. Oh boy. Let's see. Example could be my boss. Let's say you had a bad day at work and your boss yelled at you because you didn't get something in on time. So your belief could be like, my boss doesn't like me. Could be really simple, right? Like he yelled at me. He doesn't think I'm good at my job. And then you would ask yourself, is that true? And a lot of times when you first ask yourself, you're like, yeah, that's fucking true. Like, of course, he doesn't like me. He yelled at me.
Right.
And when you dig deeper with it, and Katie asked it's a whole worksheet. There's just different questions along the way. But you get down to the fact that you can't read someone else's mind. You don't know what's going on within that day. And it's not actually accurate that your boss hates you.
Exactly. And I find that to be true, or this process to be helpful in all areas of life. Mm-hmm. And just like getting caught up in worry about what may or may not happen, like in the world outside of you even. It's like, yes, there is a good chance that something will happen based on previous experience, but you cannot prove to yourself that it will happen because it's in the future, right? And there's so much time that we all spend worrying about something that happened years ago. I should have said this. I should have done this. I shouldn't have done this, blah, blah, whatever. And being worried about the future, right? Like we're in an election cycle right now. American politics is nuts. Like it doesn't matter where you fall. Like it's just a concerning time where everyone is speculating. It's all speculation. It's no different from like sports casting. Who's going to be the best team? Well, who knows? Like that's good. Channels devoted to speculation about what sports team is going to do what this season based on preseason practice, statistics of players. Okay, whatever. That's all worthless. Fine if you enjoy it, right?
Right.
You should have joy in your life, do something that's fun for you, and acknowledge that it's spending time not in the present. And I think that can really get to people.
Yeah, I think a lot of times we don't even know we're not living in the present, right?
No, of course.
Yeah, right. Same. It's not a conscious decision. It's not a conscious decision that these past experiences are creating my current reality. It's just something that is happening.
Absolutely. But going through that, taking yourself through that process can bring you back from the cliff.
Right.
Like you're about to go off the cliff because you're in these worry cycles, right?
Yeah.
And asking yourself those questions can really rein it back in. And it's a really great tool. And I think once people start unwinding that for themselves, and I find that to be incredibly helpful, especially when we're using lows, the bleeding treatments that we do in our practice. So just real quickly, guys, like the low channels are channels that use blood to store primarily emotion, but also other like toxic exposure, which I think is so interesting, that combination of things, emotion and toxic exposure, because we're basically saying our unprocessed emotion is toxic. right?
Yeah.
It will lead us to things that nobody wants to have happen, right? So we use certain points on those channels to nick with a lancet, and we let it bleed. We're talking a few drops of blood, and it's you're drastically different after that. And I think that's when it's really important. People oftentimes have that realization on their own without me even saying anything. They find that thing that's been the underlying belief for a long time that they've been holding.
Right. Because when we release it, it brings it more to the surface in a sense.
Exactly. Like you see the blood on the cotton ball. It's representative of that emotion that was held there. It's no longer in your body. And I think that allows people to have that realization that they've been operating under this false pretense for a long time.
Right.
This is not migraine related, but may still be, just interesting for people to hear. Like this woman had a cough for 10 years, and it was, kind of like she would have coughing fits all throughout the day, but no one could figure out why she had this cough. And she also saw other alternative medicine practitioners as well, alternative meaning not allopathic medicine, right? But she was cleared too. She's fine. She's having coughing all day long, and all night, but she's fine. So moving on, right? And she comes in and we get into it. And I bleed her lung low. And also she had a pericardium low. So guys, the lungs store grief. And then the pericardium is protecting the heart from feeling things or protecting who you are. And so I bled both of those channels. And then, then it came out, oh my gosh, I was always the person protecting my siblings and my family from my parents. And I forgot to protect myself, and of course, she just has this huge realization, this huge release, she cries, then she gets off the table, some time later, and she's just I feel so much more free.
Right.
I feel so much more grounded. And then the cough was virtually gone, so it's a really powerful system we have here. And I think if we can demystify it, then more people can use it and understand it and benefit from it. Or maybe reverse that, understand it, use it, and then benefit from it.
So can we dive into hormonal migraines a little bit? Because I think that's a big topic amongst women's health. And actually the only migraine I think I've ever had, I feel like my flex is that I don't get headaches. I get lots of other things, but headaches just has never been my thing, luckily. The only migraine I've ever had was when I had my second daughter, Zoe. It was about a year after she was born. I think I had just gotten my cycle back the month before. And it was the day that my period was starting. And I didn't really know because I just got my period back. I didn't know if it was regular. I was extremely nauseous. I was at the park with my daughter. I had to go home. I felt like I was about to throw up. I get home and it's just everything just goes I could see, but it's your vision's impaired. You just feel like you're in this moving bubble.
Yeah.
I guess maybe vertigo-ish. And that's the only migraine I've ever had in my life. And I assume that was hormone related. And I say hormone in quotes because what does that mean? But can you talk to me a little bit about why women tend to get migraines in their luteal phase? So after ovulation, a week or two before their period?
Yes. So the beauty of Chinese medicine is that it's principle based. So I'm sorry to be repeating myself, but it is basically the same thing. When you ovulate, that is the most yang time of your cycle. And if you don't have enough support from your yin, the yang is going to go off the rails. So then that is a really common time to have migraines mid-cycle. But then after that, your body has just done its most yang thing. Again, the get shit done, right? Energy.
Yeah.
So now we're tired. We've just dropped some eggs, people.
Right. We just got all this shit done.
Exactly. And we're worn out because we barely had the resources to get our job done to begin with. And now I'm tired. Right. I'm worn out. And so I need you to shut it down. So I am going to make you feel like crap. You're going to almost vomit at the park. We're going to need you to go home and lie down because you become unfunctional in many cases.
Right.
There are some people that have what they describe as migraines and they still go to work and whatever. There are others of us who have this experience who it is truly debilitating, cannot do anything because you literally cannot see. And you're also somehow oddly dizzy, even though you can't see. You feel like you're spinning and, it's a hot mess, but that is happening because your body needs you to really rest, to shut it down, to get extra sleep. to be in a dark, unstimulating place, right? To eat brothy soups, warm, wet foods, right? To help you support those resources that you clearly have so few of. And I think that's a great example of after having had a baby. And the first year with a baby, everyone knows, like, I mean, it's just kind of a disaster. Like,
right. And the first year with a baby and a toddler during 2020. So it was resources were used. I had no resources left in my body.
Exactly. And it's obviously like we're supported by the outside too. It's not just what we do for ourselves. And like in your case, you had a baby in the midst of COVID, and then you couldn't have the support from outside, like things that you had planned on, right? So to me, that makes perfect sense. But I think that's what is happening when people are having what I think the general public calls hormonal migraines. It's at a very similar time. Also, a patient that I was working with that I'm thinking of now, her migraines would be right before her period, her bleeding started. And so it was kind of like, okay, the body is gathering blood because it's about to shed, and we don't have enough to begin with. So that process of her having periods is so depleting to her that this is what this is what happens. Like, she's out for the count, like cannot function for 24 to 48 hours. And then it resolves and she's fine, right? But so again, like, we use these early channels that showed up in her pulse. We treated that for about 4 weeks. Then she no longer had migraines. Then other things started showing up in her pulse where we can see different types of deficiencies. So we can support her that way going forward. But all the dietary stuff, all the slowing down is going to be important for supporting that, so you don't continue to get migraines with that cycle.
Right. I feel like, the second half of your cycle, the luteal phase, is when we're most vulnerable because our bodies have used up so much energy already. And also from a biological perspective, whether you want to get pregnant or not, your body wants you to get pregnant. And that second half of the cycle is your body preparing to be pregnant, which takes a lot of energy.
100%.
And reproducing, I feel like our body puts at, the top of the list almost next to keeping us alive.
Yeah, absolutely. It's just like biology. It's like, like really basic, basic principles.
Right. Okay, great. I'm just looking. So I had some other questions from listeners. So let's talk about aura migraines. Like, what, I hear that term a lot, but what is that exactly? What does that mean?
Yeah. And some vestibular migraines. Sometimes people will be diagnosed with that as well. So just like we were talking about before, the feeling like you're spinning, the weird things with your eyes, like, so the floaters, or like sometimes people describe it as fireworks. Like, people have like very different experiences when it comes to auras. Sometimes it's like going into a tunnel. And then sometimes spotty vision. Anyway, all those kind of things can fall under aura. And in Chinese medicine, it's wind. And wind happens when there's an instability, right? I mean, I'm saying this like for people listening. I know you know this, right? But like, it is this concept of...
I'm learning from you too. I said, I'm learning from you and all your analogies also.
My analogies. I think that Chinese medicine has been shrouded in mystery for far too long. And I do not think that modern day acupuncture school is doing what it should be to educate us with a deep understanding. And I think that while we get out of school and we can help people using TCM treatments, I think that the lack of understanding means that we are doing surface level treatments and we are offering surface level explanation. And I don't think that is helping the profession, because when you put out the Instagram post that says something about Chinese medicine and it's a snippet, that sounds like a crock of shit. And the reason it sounds like a crock of shit is because we are not giving the public a full understanding of the medicine. Every time I talk to somebody about a full concept, they're like, wow, that makes so much sense. And I'm like,
versus like anger hurts your liver.
Right. Like, so there are a lot of people, popular, usually not acupuncturists, to be honest, but even acupuncturists.
Yeah.
I see acupuncturists saying stuff like this all the time, and I'm not trying to drag them, but if somebody who does this kind of stuff is listening to this, I would love for them to consider how that is seen in the eye of the public, because this medicine could literally transform millions of people's lives if we would not make blanket statements that are not fully grounded in a solid understanding. And I think people are not stupid and they can understand this language. When I say mediumship, yeah, that's a weird word. I had never heard that before either, but I know what it means now. And so do you,
Right.
you know?
So when
Analogies are an important way of like bridging the gap between this medicine that has been shrouded in mystery for millions of years, thousands of years, right? And getting people to see that it's so practical. Like it usually, always, it makes sense to people.
It's common sense medicine. Yeah.
Yeah, I think it is. And I think it's just life. It's medicine for life, you know?
Right.
And then when you start understanding the concepts, you don't need to go to your doctor or your acupuncturist or your whoever. You don't need to take your child to the whatever because you know how to handle these things at home. You know, like when your kid has a sore throat, you don't hand them a popsicle because now you know that a sore throat is heat and a popsicle is cold. And cold does not make heat go away. Cold traps the heat and creates more heat, you know, and then you don't give your kid the popsicle because you know better now. And then your kid gets better in like 24 hours. You know, it's awesome. And so I think that's why I'm drawn to the discussion because it's very, very practical. And I do think people are capable of understanding. And I know that I was that person. Like I have a very sensitive bullshit meter. And when I hear things from alternative practitioners, quote unquote, that don't have depths to them, it makes me completely write it off. I just dismiss it and I'm like, I don't want to hear about that because that just sounds so stupid. But if we really got into it and we have the meat, then people see that it's not stupid. It's not quackery. It's not snake oil. There's real depth here. And I think that's like the hill I'm going to die on.
Yeah.
I think that's why I'm here.
Yeah.
So what was your question?
So can you explain to us, so we were talking about aura migraines and how they are triggered by wind. So what is wind? How does it enter the body? And how is it coming to a migraine?
Thank you. Boy, your editor is going to have like a field day with this episode. So wind happens when you don't have enough resources. So we don't have enough yin. We don't have enough thin fluids, thick fluids, what have you. And the channels are shaky. And then heat comes into play, that trigger, and it whips up that yang energy because yang energy is it's like heat, not synonymous, I wouldn't say, but it's going to raise the yang energy, that trigger. And then it's going to stir up the wind. Like you do get wind in your lower body too, but more commonly, right? And especially talking about migraines, like we get wind in our head. And it's instability because we don't have enough grounding. So if you have migraines that are simply insane pain in your head, okay, that's like basic. Not good, but that's a sign you need more resources, but that's not severe, right? In my opinion, like we're not into the severe arena. You've got aura, you've got loss of vision, your speaking ability, your arm goes numb, your whatevers are going numb. You can't see. Those things are serious because you've got a lot of wind happening because you've got a lot of deficiency. So the name of the game is rebuilding your mediumship so that does not happen. Pain is happening because you don't have enough mediumship as well, especially in TCM school. But I think this is true in classical medicine as well. You don't have enough blood. So the blood cannot flow well. So we're getting stuck and that creates pain. The difference in classical medicine too, I would say, is that unlike modern acupuncture, we're not going to just try to shove that blood through. We need to address why you have the deficiency of blood in the first place. So we can just move it and maybe that alleviates pain in the moment. But again, we are moving. So that's yang energy and that could further create deficiency, which sounds mean, kind of like we don't want you to continue to suffer, but we don't want the treatment to be worse than the problem.
Yeah. Also, so my first analogy that I've ever come up in my life, I'm going to share it here now. When you said fire and wind, I'm picturing a forest fire and how, let's say California, I've never really been around forest fires, but how when there are forest fires and it's windy, it spreads the forest fire. It doesn't spreads it. So that's essentially what's happening in your body. You have heat, you add wind to it, and it's spreading it, and heat rises, wind rises.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And like most things in Chinese medicine, it's a vicious cycle. not always vicious, right? But like Chinese medicine is cyclical. And so like we talked about earlier, when you put cold into the equation, you're not actually quelling the heat. You're getting more heat, which then further dries, which then creates more deficiency, which then creates more pain. And then here we go again. And something we haven't talked about yet is damp. So when you're on fire, what do we want to do? We want to like put the blanket over it, the fire blanket. We want to put it out. And so your body is drawing from those yin resources, the mediumship, to try to put out the fire as best it can. So this could look like congestion, like phlegmy stuff. It could look like discharges. It could look like cysts. It could look like fibroids, right? Like I think we think of that more as blood, but any kind of like cholesterol in the arteries, right? Like building the cholesterol, and I think allopathic medicine even is coming to that understanding as well, that inflammation in the artery that then attracts the buildup of cholesterol, but it's the Chinese medicine concept at work that your body is doing what it can to respond to that. I think heat and inflammation can often be interchangeable.
Yeah.
And then all of a sudden you have a very congested artery, all in your body's attempt to save you from fire.
Right. Cholesterol has never been the problem. It's been the stagnation of cholesterol.
Right. Exactly. And that stagnation happened as a result of heat, which was drying and depleted the resource. Right. So if we want to get rid of wind, we don't really want to think about moving it out. We want to think about what is allowing the wind to happen.
Right.
Like in a forest fire example, if we could stop the wind, that would allow us to contain the fire. But we can't control nature, and wind's going to blow when it blows, and it's going to spread the fire. But in our bodies, we can look at that and say, what are the things that help spread this fire? Drinking alcohol, drinking coffee, eating spicy food, doing HIIT workouts, stressing all the time, like not managing our emotions, dealing with our stuff. Those things are going to fan the flames and make the fire bigger. And those are things that we can control, which will then also control the wind.
Right. Beautiful. Thank you for answering that, MJ. So next question, rapid fire. And you kind of started talking about this before, so I should have jumped into it there, but I didn't. So there's a big subset of doctors, probably mainly chiropractors or spine specialists, who will talk about migraines being caused by, your spine and something being off physically. I can't think of the word, but something structurally off in your body.
Yeah.
How do we see that from a Chinese medicine perspective?
I mean, I don't feel that I am overly qualified to talk about that from that perspective. But what I feel like, from our perspective, there are channels that pertain to the early years that affect our structure. And many times when we treat these channels, our structure will shift. So, if you go to a chiropractor who says that your whatever is out of line and that is the reason for your migraines, and they are able to do their treatments and help you, and that gives you relief and you're healed, then I think that's great. Like, I think you should go that route. But if it has been your experience that
I tend to disagree with you on that one, MJ. I do. And I have one chiropractor that I love, but aside from that, but no, this isn't about even the practice. But my disagreement with that is that you're not actually healing the problem, right? The problem is, why are you out of alignment? Not that you are out of alignment.
Yeah.
I think for immediate fixation or immediate relief, not bad. Like, go for it. Or if that's all you have access to, go for it.
Yep.
But I do think at a core, we need to treat the underlying issue, which is more tied to something deeper, which you're talking about.
100%. And that's why I also say, I think if it works for you, you should do it. I have never heard anybody that it works for.
Okay.
I've seen people go endlessly for care and not get better. Now, the chiropractic world is something that is, I think, similar to us in that there's a large variety of care within that field. And I don't think everyone practices the same. Everyone's not trained the same. A lot of people get out and do all kinds of involved different training, and maybe that would be better or worse. But I agree with what you're saying in that if we're not addressing why we are structurally imbalanced in the first place, it is unlikely to change permanently. And what I was also going to say is, so say that one of these channels is involved, one of these 8 extraordinary channels that are tweaked very early in life. I'm of the opinion that that tweak then leads us to behaviors and choices that deplete us further. Right. So without adjusting, like we talked about earlier, without adjusting adjusting was no pun intended, without treating that extraordinary channel that will adjust the blueprint, we're not getting to the root. So even if we do these treatments that are focused on rebuilding the mediumship, I don't think that is going to get you there either. I think you need to find where the root is. And in my experience, the root for people with migraines has been the 8 extraordinary channels. And then when you rebuild mediumship, that allows the structure to remain in the correct position. And I think that's what I would argue is missing in chiropractic care, in the type of care that is, okay, this XYZ thing is out of alignment. So we're going to do this physical adjustment, a manual adjustment to you, and that's going to fix it. Yes. And from the Chinese medicine perspective, I would say the reason why chiropractors often have massage therapists and acupuncturists in their office is because they need that additional support to keep the structure in place. And so without the mediumship to nourish the musculature, I don't believe that the bones will stay in place.
Right.
And I think there are chiropractors who are trained in methods that would be more supportive for stuff like that. It's just not my expertise. But of course, someone who's just adjusting the structure, I don't believe that that's the answer for migraines, because I think it's much deeper.
Right. And the imbalance in the 8 extraordinary channels is also why I feel like, and correct me if you disagree or is wrong, a lot of the times your diet can be spot on, but you're still having symptoms.
100%.
Yeah.
And I don't know what you've talked about with your listeners so far about diet too, but I think what I run into a lot is people who feel that their diet is really spot on because they're following modern clinical nutrition advice.
Okay, so what are 3 top dietary advice for migraines?
Oh,
or
that's 4 or
5. You can choose as many as you want.
Well, so I do, our list of foods that are very drying and depleting. I call it the shit list, and it's alcohol, coffee, onions, garlic, hot spices. What are we at? That's 4 or 5.
Okay.
And if you like to have coffee occasionally, I think that's great and you should do that. But if you, like I used to, program your coffee maker at night to grind the beans and have coffee ready for you the second your eyes open every day, this is terrible. That's not a good thing to do, right? So when I say these things to people, they're like, what? That's all I eat. I have wine, however many nights a week. I drink coffee every morning, maybe in the afternoon, maybe at lunch, whatever. Some people are drinking coffee throughout the day, even, right? This is very normal in modern society. And there are all these people who say, look at the clinical benefits of coffee and what it can do. And I just say, well, my practice is not clinical in that way. What we're basing our recommendations on is the law of signatures, on the principles of Chinese medicine, and that tells us something different about food. And you can look at it as a restrictive thing, or you can look at it like, how free would I feel if I didn't have migraines on a regular basis, or if I could get pregnant when I want to, or if I didn't have this joint pain that's debilitating, or if I didn't have this rash all over, or, whatever the case may be.
Honestly, if you're having migraines, there's something wrong, right? There's something that needs to be changed. And it's not always what you want it to be.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think too, people often do not consider migraines a disease. I think they think, as I did as well. Yeah. Oh, I'm perfectly healthy. I am healthy on paper. And then I literally get laid out by this thing. That is not health, And I was drinking coffee and I was teaching spin classes and I was taking kickboxing and I was blah, blah, right? All these things that modern society tells us is healthy. And it's simply not. It's extremely depleting. And like you said earlier, I think if you have 0 problems and you're doing these things, first of all, good for you, because that's amazing. Like, you came into the world with awesome resources and I'm happy for you, but that's not most people. And it's definitely not you if you're in the acupuncturist office, because the people who come to see us are coming to see us because they have a problem that they have not been helped by like the usual methods. Right.
So we have coffee, spicy foods. What else? I mean, not spicy food, foods that create heat in the body.
Yeah. Like, and the onions and garlic.
Mentioned that. So, yeah.
Do what?
Sorry, you mentioned that. So what is the third one?
What'd we say? Coffee, alcohol, onions, and garlic. And when I say onions and garlic, like I do tell patients, again, just like coffee, I'm not saying that you should never use onions or garlic. I'm saying that most of us buy bags of onions at the grocery store and we cook with it every day, like every day. That is going to create so much heat in doing that. So, I mean, occasionally use it, great. But like if you're also in the problem, like you need to, it's always like the corrective phase is more stringent than the maintenance phase, right?
Right. Sure.
Like if you be in popular society, right? Like if you need to lose some weight, right? Perhaps like that's really a bad example because I don't know that I agree with that anyway. But like creating new habits is going to feel more restrictive to you than once you're in the pattern.
Right.
So use onions and garlic if you want. And then I would also, I've been thinking a lot about CBD because I think cannabis is overly utilized and praised for its ability to treat windy symptoms. Like I remember years ago hearing about how a family moved to Colorado because it was one of the original states that legalized cannabis and CBD. And it was helpful for their child who had like 200 seizures a day.
Wow.
And
which is a wind condition for those listening.
Yeah. So seizures is a great example of wind. Even febrile seizures, like when your kids are having, if your kids have not had this, right? Like, but you've heard of people rushing their kids to the hospital because they're having febrile seizures. That's a good example of wind. The heat is so hot that then they have the seizure and that wind.
And children tend to be more young, which is why children are more susceptible to it.
Exactly. And children do not usually eat warm, wet food.
Yeah.
On top
to my children.
Right. What does your kid like to eat? Like cold, dry things, Yeah. And again, like the culture thinks that goldfish is an appropriate snack for a young child. To me, that's junk food. We have food dye. It's dry, like it has literally no nutrition in it. And right, like
it looks like a fish, so it's kind of fun.
Right, okay. Fish. They are cute, right?
Bunnies. Cheddar bunnies. Yeah.
Cheddar bunny. Right. Same difference. It's all the same. Like, and again, just like the coffee, occasionally, if you want to have that, that's wonderful. I think it should be enjoyed. And that's not how we do it. Every time we go to the park, we pack the cheddar bunnies. We pack all these snacks and they're drying. And so it just feeds the fire that already is the kid. Anyhow, back on track. What were we talking about?
Things people can do at home diet-wise in order to help prevent or, ultimately treat migraines.
Yeah, absolutely. So the what we've been talking about essentially is what are the things you need to like get out of your diet because they're creating heat. And then I think we can move on from that and say, what do we need to add? So this is really not popular as well. Like we need whole cooked grains, right? So like if you have been listening to a dietitian or reading all the modern advice, like you should definitely throw that out the window basically here. So we're not talking about whole grain chips. We're talking about when you buy loose grain and you soak it, or you put it in an Instant Pot, you cook it in water, and when it comes out of the pot, it looks about like what it did when you put in. It still has the same shape, color, right? And then as you eat that, the view from Chinese medicine is that it is sort of a time-released hydration, so that when we are hydrating ourselves, we are still drinking water, but we think more about the food that we eat, creating a lot better, like more resources, like better mediumship by what we're eating. And then water is more for the cleansing perspective. And I find that the better I do personally with eating warm, wet food, so cooked food like that has broth in it, or the whole grains, or the stewed meat, right? Not grilled chicken, not, certainly not like fried. Again, if you want to do that occasionally, that's wonderful. On a regular basis, we want like wet stuff, like probably at this point, our great grandmothers would have cooked. That stuff is going to add hydration. And I do notice that the more I eat like that, the less thirsty I am. Cause I see that as a really common thing too. People say, oh my gosh, like I drink a gallon of water every day. And I'm like, oh, that's diagnostic for me. Like that tells me that you do not have enough mediumship because you would not need that much water. And the person that is like kind of red complected, right? Like you can see the heat like coming up basically.
Right.
Because they're not nourished enough.
Right.
So yes, for sure, keep drinking water, but there's no like amount of water that is recommended from a Chinese medicine perspective because really we're looking at hydrating ourselves through diet. And I think that is a drastic departure from what we're taught, just living in the modern world. But if you think about Asian cultures and the food that you get when you just even in America, go to those restaurants, like there are a lot of brothy things involved. Like a Japanese restaurant almost always serves you a small bowl of miso soup with anything else that you order. And it doesn't mean that nothing is fried or nothing is sort of dry cooked. It definitely can be, but then it's also served with a little bit of rice and the vegetables are cooked,
Great, wonderful. Do you have any tips for people in the moment when they're in a migraine? Like what do you do when you have a migraine?
Bleed yourself. And I have a class on this.
Yes, MG has a wonderful class. I'm going to link, obviously, her information in the show notes where you can find your class. But a little bit more about what that is.
Yeah. So something that we haven't really talked about is most of the time when people get migraines, they say that their pain is on the side of their head.
Okay.
Usually it's not all over, right? Sometimes it is. Right. But a lot of times it's on one side or the other. Right. And like we know that this is the gallbladder channel and modern acupuncturists are taught in school to treat the gallbladder when someone has a migraine. And this is what I mentioned in the very beginning was happening to me in the school clinic. And now I know what was going on and why it was a terrible idea. The gallbladder is getting stressed because it doesn't have the resources it needs. And so we've got stagnation. It's hurting on this side, right? I want to explain this because I want you to know why I think you should get out a lancet when you're already hurting and bleed yourself.
Okay. And for those who don't know, a lancet is a needle that you can get at any pharmacy. It's diabetic needles that you would use to.
Yeah, absolutely. Yourself. Like I order them on Amazon myself because I like a larger gauge because I think it works better if you get the really fine ones that are used for glucose monitoring. Sometimes they don't work as well, but it still hurts. So I would rather just make sure I've like covered my bases, poke myself once and be done with it.
Right. And this is all
the gallbladder
is all in your course.
What's that?
Sorry, I was just saying this is all in your course.
Yeah, I'll teach you all this. But like, I'm also wanting to explain to people why they would want to consider this. And I'm like a why person. Again, like I said, my bullshit meter is very sensitive and I like to know the why so that I don't feel like I'm being sold a load of crap. And I think that it's drastically helpful if you can do this. So the gallbladder is upset and the gallbladder is our yang organ that is paired with the liver, our yin organ. The liver's job is to send blood in and out to wherever it needs to go. In this case, we're talking about it needs to send blood to the gallbladder. The liver cannot do that if it does not have enough money. I got ahead of myself because I was going to use an analogy here. The liver does not have enough blood, so it can't send what it doesn't have. But it's not the liver's fault. The spleen is not doing well over here, and its job is to manufacture blood and so that the liver can have it to send to the gallbladder. So my mini class on bleeding is to bleed the spleen and the liver so that when we bleed the spleen low channel, we have taken off the pressure that is making the spleen deficient so that it can resume its normal function and it can help support the liver. And then we're also taking the pressure off the liver so that it can do its job and send to the gallbladder. And this is why I recommend bleeding liver and spleen when you have a migraine. There's certainly other options. So, other classical practitioners who are listening to this, they might be thinking, well, what about this? What about that? Yes. There's other options.
An acupuncture stand view from someone just sitting at home with a migraine.
Yes, absolutely. Because I personally, in all my years of having migraines, have never found the slam dunk for what to do when I'm in the migraine. I mean, I wish I had like this great experience. I really do. I don't. A quiet, dark room. I would not do the ice packs, the ice wrap. Like I would meditate. That is what I do. I'd been migraine free for 6 years until this year. And I had some problems creep back up, which was disappointing, but it also shows me Chinese medicine at work. Was I depleted? I guess so. Like what was coming up emotionally for me and causing these problems to come back, right? And so as I work to deal with that and to rebuild, then the problems are going away again. So they're not as severe. And I believe that remission is possible. And I think it's possible for everyone. They just need to use this information. So in the migraine, don't do things that are going to make it worse for you, like harder tomorrow,
right?
Just to relieve yourself today.
Right. That's good advice. So to end, I just want to, maybe to end, we'll see, but I just want to tie up two concepts that we talked about earlier. So we talked about the emotional aspect of what you see most in your practice causing migraines. And then we talked about the structural aspect, right? And can you explain how that's connected essentially through the cloud?
The channels that are formed early on that deal with structure also deal with how we see ourselves and the world. And when we treat those channels, we're going to many times adjust our structure is going to adjust. And in that, there is emotion, right? These channels can also receive overflow from the low channels. And we talked about the low channels earlier, where I was saying that they are the channels that use the blood to store unprocessed emotion, but sometimes they can get overwhelmed and they need a place to offload. And these early channels that I was mentioning, the chals can be a reservoir for the overflow of the lows. So all of, one category of lows would go to one of the chals, another would go to the other one, right? But like both of those could affect structure and also contain within it the unprocessed emotion. So when we could treat those in various ways. That's not the point to talk about that in this podcast, right? But there are different ways we could go about using them. And then with releasing the emotion, the structure also shifts. And, like Anne talks about how our posture indicates certain emotions that people who walk in a certain way, right? So let me sit up straight.
I'm putting up straighter now.
I'm not very skilled in this. I don't know a ton about it, right? But there is a structure that people who are very angry over time, they walk in a certain way, their neck is in a certain way, their chin, their head, right? It changes over time because you've been holding something that was not good for you, but you didn't have the skills to deal with it in a different way. So here we are, like we're all just like human.
So essentially the emotions of not feeling good about yourself or feeling like the world is against you are the same emotions that tie to creating our structural stance and the structure of our spine, essentially attribute to migraines.
I think there's a lot of that. I've really seen I think I've seen at this point every 8 Extraordinary channel be involved, across patients, right? So I can't, but I do see a lot of chals. There's some kind of fuzz floating. So I don't think, like if someone's an acupuncturist and they're listening to this and they're like, oh, great. Like I'm going to go in and I'm going to use this channel. I'm just going to treat my patient that has migraines with this. I wouldn't recommend that. It's very individualized and, the way we practice is, relies upon the pulse to tell us the things that the patients don't remember about their own experiences. Because like I mentioned before, some of those experiences could have literally been when we were born. We don't have usually conscious memory of our birth, but that doesn't mean that it's insignificant, to us. I can think of other examples like that as well. People not remembering things, but that doesn't mean that it's not in their body and it's not affecting them.
Yeah, that's very common. I've heard from trauma therapists that a sign that you've had trauma in your childhood is simply not being able to remember a lot from your childhood. So
100%.
Yeah.
And I do again think that the beauty of this medicine is that someone does not have to come in and say, I had this terrible experience as a 5-year-old. And I think that that's why I have rheumatoid arthritis.
Right. They don't need to connect the dots for themselves.
Exactly. exactly. And it's actually been my experience that people don't until it comes up in the pulse and we use that channel in treatment. And then later they say, you know what? I think it might be relevant for me to share, because it comes to mind and it becomes apparent to them. And I think the sharing it can be very important if it allows them to be freer. If it's just sharing to rehash something, that may not be quite as effective. But many times I would say that it's not many times, I would say always, it's the channel that's doing the work, right? So like we're just assisting by utilizing the channel, and then the patient does what they will.
Right. Wonderful. Thank you for being here today, MG. Can you let our listeners know where they can find you? And we'll tag it in the show notes as well.
Oh yeah. Thank you so much. This was really fun. Of course, continuing our conversations from daily text messaging.
Right. Me and MG talk about the time.
All the time. I love conversation. It's so fun. I'm Dr. MG McCullough on Instagram, and that's my website as well, drmgmccullough.com. I think that's it.
Wonderful. Thank you so much.
Thank you.